In the autumn of 1939, Europe was already burning, but in the far north, there was still a quiet that felt untouched by history. Finland was a thin line of forest and snow between empires, a country most of the world barely noticed. It had no great industrial power, no massive army, no colonies, no voice in global politics. To Moscow, Finland was not a nation. It was a problem of geography, a border too close to Leningrad, a strip of land that needed to be corrected. And correction, in the Soviet mindset, was never a negotiation. It was an operation. The Red Army at that time was the largest military force on Earth. Millions of men under arms, tens of thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. An institution that had crushed internal enemies and expanded Soviet control across vast territories. Its officers were raised on the idea that numbers were destiny. That ideology made soldiers superior, and that resistance from smaller nations was temporary by definition. Finland, with a population barely larger than a Soviet city, was not seen as a battlefield. It was seen as a formality. Soviet planners expected a campaign that would last days, perhaps weeks at most. Their reports described Finland as politically divided, militarily weak, and psychologically fragile. The Finnish army was small, lightly equipped, and lacked modern armor or air power. Their weapons were old, their uniforms thin, their supply lines limited. On paper, Finland did not have an army capable of resisting a mechanized superpower. It had hunters, farmers, and reservists. Men who skied and cut timber. Men who knew forests better than parade grounds. Men who had never fought a modern war, and that was precisely why they were dismissed. Inside the Soviet command structure, there was no serious debate about whether Finland could resist. The only question was how quickly. Soviet propaganda described the coming invasion as a liberation, a necessary correction, a protection of Soviet security. Officers told their men they would be welcomed by Finnish workers and peasants, that the government in Helsinki would collapse once faced with reality, that this would be a political march, not a military campaign. The Red Army moved toward the Finnish border with confidence that bordered on boredom. Soldiers carried winter gear that was insufficient, weapons that had not been tested in Arctic conditions, and expectations shaped by ideology rather than terrain. Tanks were prepared for roads that did not exist. Columns were built for movement through open land that was actually a maze of frozen forest and lakes. Maps were inaccurate. Intelligence was shallow. The land itself was treated as an inconvenience, not a weapon. In Moscow, Finland was spoken of as a minor chapter in a much larger story. The Soviet Union was rising. Europe was collapsing. Borders were being rewritten. Finland was just a line that needed to be erased and redrawn. There was no hatred, no fear, no urgency, only certainty. In Helsinki, the mood was different. There was no illusion of strength. Finland did not believe it could overpower the Soviet Union. It only believed it could survive. That distinction shaped everything. Finnish leadership knew the war, if it came, would not be won by matching firepower. It would be fought by delay, disruption, and exhaustion. Not victory, but not dominance, but denial. The Finnish army did not pretend to be modern. It prepared to be invisible. Its doctrine was built on movement through forests, silence in darkness, and the ability to live where no supply line could follow. Soldiers trained to ski in formation, to disappear into white landscapes, to strike and vanish before the enemy understood what had happened. They did not prepare to hold cities. They prepared to make roads useless. They did not prepare to face tanks head-on. They prepared to isolate them. While Soviet officers mocked Finnish weakness, Finnish commanders studied Soviet habits. Long columns, heavy reliance on roads, centralized command, slow adaptation. The Red Army was powerful, but it was rigid. Finland had no power, but it had flexibility. That difference was invisible on maps. It would only appear in blood and frost. When negotiations failed in late November, the Soviet invasion became inevitable. The excuse was simple: border security. The real intention was control. On November 30th, 1939, Soviet artillery opened fire across the Finnish frontier. Bombs fell on Helsinki. Soviet aircraft struck cities and infrastructure. The war that was expected to be a correction began as a declaration. The Red Army crossed the border with more than 450,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and absolute confidence. They expected resistance to break in days. They believed the Finnish government would collapse. They believed their presence would be overwhelming. They believed the war was already decided. Finland responded with silence. No massed counterattack, no dramatic defense, no attempt to appear strong, just disappearance. Finnish units withdrew into forests. Ski troops moved away from roads. Observation posts watched Soviet columns advance without interference. The Red Army moved forward as if into empty land. That emptiness was misinterpreted as fear. This was the first mistake. Soviet officers reported smooth progress, no major resistance, no organized defense. The absence of battle was taken as proof that Finland was already broken. They pushed deeper, longer, and faster than caution would allow. Their supply lines stretched. Their columns lengthened. Their sense of danger faded. But the forest was not empty. It was waiting. Every Finnish soldier knew the terrain was their only advantage. Snow that slowed tanks made skis faster. Darkness that confused columns made ambushes precise. Cold that weakened unprepared troops strengthened those who had lived in it all their lives. Finland was not preparing to fight an army. It was preparing to fight certainty. The first snow fell heavily as Soviet forces advanced. Temperatures dropped. Equipment failed. Engines froze. Weapons jammed. Soviet soldiers, many from southern regions, were unprepared for Arctic conditions. Finnish troops, in white camouflage, moved through the same landscape like part of it. They did not appear. They revealed themselves only when necessary, and when they did, the Red Army would not understand what it was facing, because they had not prepared for an enemy that refused to be seen. The first real engagements did not come as battles. They came as absences. Soviet units moved along narrow forest roads, their columns stretching for kilometers, tanks in front, trucks bent, infantry walking in lines that assumed safety through mass. It was the doctrine of overwhelming presence, but in the Finnish forests, presence meant exposure. Every road was a corridor of vulnerability. Every clearing was a stage. Every pause was an invitation. At first, Finnish forces did not strike the front of these columns. They cut the edges. A truck vanished. A sentry failed to report. A radio operator was found dead without sound of gunfire. There was no explosion, no firefight, no proof of contact, only silence where life had been moments before. Soviet commanders recorded these incidents as isolated accidents, desertions, mechanical failures. They did not yet recognize a pattern. Then the columns began to slow. Soldiers grew tense. They started firing into trees without seeing targets. Ammunition was wasted on shadows. Every sound became a threat. Finnish troops understood this instinctively. Fear was easier to create than casualties. Confusion was more damaging than bullets. In the region of Suomussalmi and along the right road, the Red Army advanced in dense formations meant for open warfare. Finnish patrols followed them invisibly. They observed. They counted. They memorized habits. When they struck, it was not to destroy, but to fragment. A column once broken into pieces was no longer an army. It became isolated groups, blind and panicked in hostile terrain. Soviet memoirs later described the same moment. The realization that the enemy was not in front, but everywhere. A soldier wrote that the forest itself felt alive, that every tree might hide a rifle, that the snow seemed to move when no wind blew. This was not myth. It was the result of deliberate Finnish discipline. They avoided contact until conditions were perfect. They retreated when detection risk grew. They attacked only when silence could be restored immediately afterward. When firefights finally erupted, they were brief and violent. A burst of automatic fire, a grenade, then nothing. Finnish units did not pursue. They did not hold ground. Banise. Soviet troops would fire blindly into darkness long after the attackers were gone, unsure whether the battle had ended or merely paused. The Soviet command structure was not built for an invisible enemy. Orders were slow. Communication was centralized. Junior officers waited for instructions even as conditions collapsed. Finnish troops exploited this delay. They moved faster than paperwork. They adjusted faster than doctrine. They were not bound to roads, formations, or timetables. At Rot Road, a full Soviet division advanced in a single long column through frozen forest, confident that resistance had already collapsed. Finnish commanders watched this movement with disbelief, not because of its strength, but because of its vulnerability. The entire formation could be cut into pieces with a handful of men and a few well-placed strikes. And that is exactly what happened. Finnish units severed the road at multiple points, creating isolated pockets of Soviet soldiers trapped without supplies or communication. These pockets were later called Marty, a term borrowed from firewood stacks, because each group could be dealt with individually once separated. The Red Army had brought overwhelming force. Finland answered with geometry. Soviet tanks were useless without infantry support. Infantry froze without supply. Supply trucks could not move without protection. Each element depended on the others. Once separation occurred, the system collapsed. Finnish soldiers did not need to destroy everything. They only needed to stop movement. Temperatures fell below -30°C. Soviet troops lacked proper winter clothing. Frostbite spread faster than wounds. Weapons froze. Engines refused to start. Wounded men died before they could be evacuated. Finnish troops, lightly equipped but adapted, survived where Soviet logistics failed. They used campfires carefully, hidden by terrain. They carried minimal supplies and lived off what could be moved silently. Soviet officers began reporting panic. Soldiers refused to leave shelters. Patrols vanished. Units stopped responding. Some formations fired on each other in the dark, unable to identify friend from enemy. The Red Army, built on control and discipline, was unraveling in a place where neither could be maintained. One Soviet survivor later wrote that they never saw the Finns as soldiers, only as shadows. Shapes that appeared, killed, and disappeared without sound. The humiliation was not in defeat. It was in helplessness. They could not fight an enemy they could not find. Yet still, Soviet command believed the solution was more force, more men, more tanks, more pressure. They interpreted resistance as desperation. They assumed Finland was exhausting itself, that the silence meant weakness. In reality, silence was how Finland conserved strength. The Red Army was fighting geography, climate, and psychology simultaneously, and winning against none. The deeper they pushed, the less control they had. The more they advanced, the more blind they became. What was supposed to be a march turned into a crawl. What was supposed to be dominance turned into dependence. And the snow, once white and untouched, began to carry color. Not from one great battle, but from thousands of small, unseen confrontations that no Soviet plan had accounted for. By the heart of winter, the forests of Finland had become more than terrain. They were allies, silent and omnipresent, teaching a lesson the Red Army had refused to believe. Every tree, every ravine, every frozen lake was part of a larger system designed to make the invader visible only when it was too late. Finnish forces did not move as units in the conventional sense. They moved as shadows, as whispers in snow, as an intelligence network of men who knew every slope and hollow. There were no grand charges, no mass formations, only movement calibrated to the rhythm of survival and observation. Soviet intelligence had assumed that the Finns would defend villages, towns, and roads with courage proportional to their size. They were wrong. Finnish soldiers abandoned cities and let them burn, retreating into forests where tanks could not follow and rifles could strike from angles no map could reveal. Entire divisions believed they were pursuing enemy formations along roads, but the enemy had evaporated. Columns would advance through blinding snow only to find supply lines cut, roads mined, and retreat paths blocked by men who were never supposed to be there. Finnish tactics were designed not to win battles, but to disorient an army and fragment its cohesion. The Marty system became a nightmare for Soviet officers. Units were trapped in frozen pockets, surrounded by forest and silence. 4 weeks, the Red Army attempted to resupply by foot, by truck, and by air, all while Finnish skiers observed every movement. Finnish units struck in the early morning and late evening. then disappeared into trees, leaving Soviet soldiers bewildered. Every encounter imposed psychological strain far beyond the physical cost. Officers wrote of men breaking down in the snow, shouting orders that could not be obeyed, firing at shadows, and freezing in place with terror. Even artillery, considered a force multiplier, became a liability. Snow and forests distorted sound and direction, rendering most barrages ineffective. Finnish troops had no interest in holding territory in the open. They allowed Soviet shells to pass over them, then struck supply depots and isolated troops behind the front line. Tanks were immobilized in snowdrifts, fuel ran out, and engines froze. The invaders began to die, not from superior firepower, but from the combination of exposure, confusion, and exhaustion. Winter itself became a weapon. Finnish soldiers wore white camouflage that rendered them invisible against the snow. They skied silently through forests where no vehicle could pass. They set traps, ambushes, and barriers designed to channel Soviet movements into kill zones. Communication was minimal, and they used runners and signals that were almost impossible to intercept. From a distance, it appeared as if the forests themselves were attacking. Soviet officers began to suspect sabotage in every broken radio, every misdirected unit, every failed supply convoy. The Finns also understood human psychology in warfare. They did not merely kill, they terrorized. Soldiers described waking to find their comrades gone, their tents emptied, footprints leading nowhere, and faint sounds of movement in the trees. Panic spread faster than any bullet. Troops fired into shadows, making more mistakes, fracturing formations, and retreating into snow. Confidence. The foundation of the Red Army's doctrine was eroded quietly, invisibly, relentlessly. Cultural misunderstanding deepened the chaos. Soviet officers treated their enemy as an inferior, easily intimidated force. They assumed that large formations, mechanized superiority, and ideological certainty could dominate any smaller opponent. Finnish troops never attempted to prove themselves by frontal assault. They were never brash. They were methodical, patient, and invisible. Every act of restraint was mistreated as weakness, every withdrawal as fear, every silence as surrender. This misunderstanding would cost the Red Army more than any failed attack. By midwinter, Finnish forces had transformed the forest into a living weapon. Soviet columns were reduced to fragments, encircled, and frozen in place. The snow, once pure and indifferent, carried the first stains of battle. Not in great offensives, not in dramatic charges, but in countless small engagements where a handful of Finnish men determined the fate of entire Soviet units. No propaganda could prepare Moscow for this. No map could depict it. No doctrine had accounted for an army that thrived in silence, in invisibility, in a landscape that punished hubris. Every report that reached Soviet headquarters carried a tone of disbelief. Officers admitted later that they could not understand how so few men could immobilize divisions. They described Finnish tactics as elusive, cunning, and impossible to predict. Yet the orders continued. Push forward. Rely on numbers. Force the breakthrough. Commanders ignored evidence, because to acknowledge it would be to admit that assumptions about Finland's weakness were entirely false. The forests were no longer merely land, they were the front line, the weapon, and the judge of an empire's arrogance. And in this silence, the first cracks in morale became visible. Units stopped following orders. Communications were misinterpreted. Fear, subtle and invisible, spread faster than any Finnish bullet. Soldiers fired at shadows. Officers shouted commands that went unanswered. Anti-divisions, confidant just weeks before, froze in indecision. Finland had no tanks to match the Soviets. It had no air force to contest the skies, but it had something far deadlier. Mastery of terrain, mastery of winter, and mastery of human perception. This is when the Red Army began to understand, too late, that Finland was not weak. It was lethal, patient, and invisible. The snow had turned red, not in a single, climactic battle, but in 1,000 quiet, deliberate confrontations. By the time the world would hear of these events, many would dismiss them as exaggeration. Yet in those forests, amid frost and shadow, the strongest army in Europe was learning, at terrible cost, the lesson that survival does not always look like victory. By midwinter, the Red Army's confidence had begun to unravel. What had been a predictable advance, a march through forests assumed empty, had transformed into chaos. Officers found their columns delayed for days by obstacles that seemed minor, yet multiplied in effect: frozen rivers, snow-choked roads, collapsed bridges. Units that should have been in contact with each other vanished from the maps. Commanders began receiving reports that made no sense. Entire regiments lost, supply convoys intercepted with no sign of attackers, soldiers disappearing in the night. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Soviet officers later wrote that a profound sense of vulnerability took hold. Soldiers were constantly on edge. Every sound snap of a branch, distant animal cry, shifting snow was perceived as an attack. Night patrols were impossible, even in daylight. Lines could not be trusted. Units firing blindly into the forests were as likely to strike their own men as the enemy. Disciplined, the foundation of the Red Army's power began to crumble. Fear spread faster than frostbite, and panic quietly replaced confidence. The Finns did not need large battles to win. They only needed to manipulate perception. Small ambushes, fleeting engagements, disappearing units all combined to make the Soviets believe they were confronting a force larger, faster, and more intelligent than reality allowed. Psychological warfare became more powerful than rifles. Entire Soviet battalions hesitated, waiting for attacks that never came. Convinced the forests were filled with men they could not see, officers shouted orders, but hesitation had already taken root. The snow itself became a medium of terror. Even Soviet veterans admitted later that the Red Army had underestimated not only the Finns' skill but their mindset. Finnish soldiers were calm, patient, and resilient. They did not panic. They did not Each ambush, each isolated engagement, reinforced the perception of omnipresence. For every Soviet attack that succeeded, there were 3 more that failed or vanished into the forest. Confidence turned to paranoia. Units stopped advancing without detailed reconnaissance. Soldiers began refusing orders they considered suicidal. The human cost of fear was staggering. Frostbite, hunger, and confusion took more lives than combat itself. Soldiers froze in place, unable to move. Artillery crews abandoned guns they could not fire. Tanks, immobilized in snowdrifts, became traps. Men who had marched proudly from Moscow now crouched silently in the cold, whispering rumors of ghosts and forest spirits. Commanders could no longer trust reports from their own units. Fear had no face. It had no leader. It spread invisibly, silently, across hundreds of kilometers. Finnish doctrine capitalized on this. Ski troops moved silently to interdict supply lines, attack isolated units, and vanish before counterattacks could be organized. They struck at night, in blizzards, through frozen lakes, creating the impression of forces appearing from nowhere. Every skirmish, no matter how small, amplified the myth of an omnipresent enemy. Soviet officers began to believe that Finland had deployed far more soldiers than reality permitted. Intelligence failures, combined with effective Finnish deception, amplified fear into something almost cultural misunderstanding deepened the impact. Soviet soldiers assumed that Finnish troops would act like them, to hold ground, to pursue, to engage in visible displays of force. Instead, the Finns seemed to ignore the Soviets entirely, striking only when conditions were perfect and then disappearing as if the fight had never occurred. This behavior, combined with harsh winter conditions, created a psychological trap. Soldiers fired into empty forests, attacked their own formations by mistake, and panicked at shadows. Each minor success of Finnish troops amplified the perception of omnipotence, turning fear into a weapon without a single artillery barrage. The breakdown in morale was compounded by communication failures. Commanders could not coordinate movements across frozen forests. Units became isolated and dependent on assumptions rather than facts. Rumors of ambushes, massacres, and phantom units circulated through divisions, spreading terror faster than winter could freeze the land. By the end of January, the Red Army's advance had slowed dramatically. Entire formations were immobilized, trapped by fear and terrain. What had begun as an invasion of a weak nation had become a struggle for survival in a hostile, unyielding environment. By the time Soviet officers recognized the threat, the psychological damage was irreversible. Troops hesitated, commanders second-guessed orders, and the illusion of superiority The very foundation of the Red Army's confidence had been shattered. The forests of Finland had become an active participant in the war, silent, patient, and relentless. The snow that had once been white now carried the first traces of the invaders' hubris, a warning that no army, however large, could ignore the lessons of terrain, climate, and human adaptability. Finland had not yet delivered a decisive blow, but it had already won the war of perception. Fear had become a force multiplier. Confusion had become strategy, and silence had become the deadliest weapon of all. The Red Army, the mightiest army on the continent, faced an enemy that it could not see, could not anticipate, and could not understand. And in that quiet, bitter winter, the seeds of humiliation were sown. By late January, the Red Army faced a reality that no map, no report, and no doctrine had prepared it for. Columns that should have been unstoppable were fragmented, immobilized, and trapped in frozen pockets across the forests of eastern Finland. Entire divisions, numbering tens of thousands of soldiers, had been reduced to scattered groups, barely able to move, their supply lines severed, their communications lost, their morale shattered. The Soviet command had assumed that sheer weight of numbers would dictate victory, that overwhelming manpower could crush resistance. Finland proved that numbers alone were meaningless. The maantitaktiikka, isolation and encirclement of enemy units, became the centerpiece of Finnish strategy. Small ski troops, often no more than a platoon or two, moved silently to cut roads, ambush supply convoys, and surround larger Soviet units. Tanks and artillery, which might have turned the tide in open terrain, were confined to roads and frozen lakes, vulnerable and slow. The Soviets could not mass their firepower without exposing themselves to ambushes, and attempts to concentrate forces only created more targets. Every new soldier sent forward became another liability, another chance for the Finns to fragment the attack further. Soviet officers later wrote of disbelief and humiliation. Regimental commanders who had led thousands of men into Poland or across Central Asia now found their units cut off, freezing, and unable to advance. Messages requesting reinforcements went unanswered. Attempts to regroup failed. Men fired at shadows, collided with their own units, or surrendered to silence. The concept of numerical superiority, so central to Red Army doctrine, had been rendered irrelevant by terrain, skill, and psychological warfare. In some areas, Soviet troops tried to overwhelm Finnish positions through sheer repetition. Columns would advance, be ambushed, retreat, regroup, and advance again. Each repetition was punished with attrition. Food ran out. Ammunition became scarce. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed more soldiers than rifles. By mid-February, entire Soviet battalions had disappeared from operational maps. Survivors spoke of forests that seemed alive, men they never saw, and attacks that vanished as quickly as they appeared. The myth of invincibility, fostered by years of centralized control and ideological indoctrination, had been shattered. Finnish troops, by contrast, operated on discipline, observation, and patience. They understood that survival depended on restraint, not bravado. They moved as a network rather than a mass, striking at weaknesses rather than confronting strength. They did not celebrate or gloat. Their victories were quiet and invisible. Ishmari reduced the enemy's effective strength, without costing more than a handful of Finnish lives. The contrast between Soviet losses and Finnish losses grew stark and undeniable. Even when Soviet forces attempted to concentrate superior numbers to break through, they failed repeatedly. Columns encountered frozen rivers, snow-laden forests, and ambushes at every turn. Tanks became trapped in snowdrifts. Supply convoys were destroyed. Isolated units were forced to surrender or perish. The Red Army's commanders had assumed that more men would always produce results. Finland demonstrated that more men could also produce more confusion, more vulnerability, and ultimately more defeat. By February, the narrative of weakness had reversed entirely. Soldiers who had laughed at Finland's small population and limited technology now feared it. Officers admitted later that they could not predict where the next ambush would occur, could not understand how small forces could immobilize entire divisions, and could not restore order in the forests. Fear and disorganization had become weapons as lethal as any rifle or artillery piece. The snow, once a neutral landscape, had been transformed into an ally for those who knew it, a prison for those who did not. At the front lines, Soviet troops began to surrender in large numbers, not from defeat in battle, but from exhaustion and isolation. Entire regiments were taken without major combat simply because they were trapped, cut off, and frozen. Finnish ski troops ensured that these prisoners were handled efficiently, without unnecessary risk. The forest, silence, and cold had done what force alone could not: destroy cohesion, fracture command, and render overwhelming numbers irrelevant. The lesson became clear to anyone observing from the rear. Quantity is no substitute for understanding. The Red Army's doctrine, built on mass and ideology, failed against an opponent that leveraged knowledge, skill, and the natural environment. Finland, a nation of just over 5 million, had reduced Europe's largest army to a collection of frozen, frightened, and disoriented fragments. Numbers had not only failed to achieve dominance, they had amplified disaster. By the end of this phase of the war, Soviet officers reportedly described the experience as walking into a trap that did not exist. Their superiors in Moscow refused to fully acknowledge the extent of the debacle, but the soldiers on the ground knew the truth. Finland's forests, snow, and winter-trained troops had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. The Red Army had learned the hardest lesson of all: superior numbers, without understanding, without adaptation, and without respect for the enemy, could not guarantee victory. The snow, the forests, and the silence had done more than protect a nation. They had humiliated one of the most powerful armies in history. By the time the world would take notice, these events would be called a miracle, a fluke, or a heroic resistance. But in truth, they were neither. They were the product of careful planning, ruthless patience, and an intimate understanding of terrain and human psychology. Finland had shown that, in war, mastery of environment and mind could overcome the mightiest of forces, and that arrogance, once unchallenged, could turn to catastrophe. By early March, the scope of the Winter War's human cost had become undeniable. Finland had not been invincible. It had not annihilated the Red Army. It had survived. Every victory had come with a price. Soldiers who had mastered snow and forests now carried the weight of frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. Villages had burned. Homes had been destroyed. Families had fled or been displaced. Finland had avoided total conquest, but survival demanded relentless sacrifice. Soviet troops, by contrast, had suffered losses far beyond what raw numbers suggested. Entire units disappeared into forests, frozen rivers, or ambushes. Estimates later revealed tens of thousands dead, tens of thousands wounded, and far more suffering from frostbite and illness. The largest army in Europe had been immobilized, humiliated, and forced into retreat by an enemy it had assumed would crumble. The psychological toll, officers admitted in memoirs, was as damaging as any physical defeat. Men could not sleep. They feared forests that seemed alive, shadows that moved with intention, and the sudden, invisible threat of the Finnish ski troops. The Red Army had learned that technology and numbers could not substitute for adaptation and understanding. Tanks and artillery were lethal only when they could be used effectively. In frozen forests, they became monuments to hubris. Soldiers accustomed to order and obedience found themselves acting on instinct, improvising in desperation, and often failing. Commanders' confidence crumbled as reports of missing units, destroyed supply lines, and unseen enemy attacks mounted. Victory had been assumed. Survival had become the true struggle. Finnish forces, meanwhile, faced their own limits. They had no illusions about glory. Every ambush, every encirclement, every long ski march came at a cost. Soldiers endured harsh winters with limited rations, medical care that barely sufficed, and fatigue that threatened both health and morale. The Finnish government, aware of the stakes, focused on endurance and practicality rather than heroism. Victory was not defined by destruction of the enemy, but by the nation's continued existence. Even the few captured Soviet soldiers were a grim reminder of the war's brutality. Those taken alive had often survived frostbite, hunger, and confusion, only to face the organized, controlled hand of Finnish forces. Officers treated prisoners efficiently, but without ceremony. There was no grand triumph in the act. The war had reduced combat to calculation, patience, and relentless adaptation. The world outside Finland watched with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Newspapers described heroic resistance, miraculous victories, and the David versus Goliath nature of the conflict. Some recognized the Finnish skill, but few fully understood the combination of environmental mastery, psychological warfare, and strict discipline that had made survival possible. Misinterpretation was inevitable. Myths of invincibility replaced the reality of calculated endurance. For Finland, the Winter War would leave permanent scars. Infrastructure was damaged, civilians had endured terror, and soldiers carried the physical and emotional consequences of months in the Arctic winter. Survival had been achieved not through overwhelming power or decisive battles, but through the intelligent use of knowledge, patience, and adaptation. Every Finnish victory was measured, calculated, and often invisible to the outside observer. The Red Army's failures were just as invisible, hidden beneath snowdrifts, in forests, and behind frozen rivers. When the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed in March 1940, Finland ceded territory, but it retained its independence. The Red Army had not conquered the nation. Its reputation, however, had been severely damaged. Soldiers and commanders alike had been forced to confront an enemy they had dismissed, underestimated, and misunderstood. Finland's survival was a testament to the power of preparation, discipline, and environmental mastery over brute force. The lesson extended beyond geography or strategy. It was a warning to every military power that arrogance could be fatal. Knowledge of terrain, adaptation to climate, understanding of human psychology, and the patient application of tactics could allow a smaller force to survive and even dominate a larger, battery-equipped opponent. Victory in war is rarely measured by annihilation alone. Often, it is measured by the continued existence of a people, the preservation of a nation, and the humiliation of those who assumed supremacy. The snow that had once been indifferent now bore witness. It had preserved the independence of a nation. It had tested one of the largest armies in Europe. It had transformed fear, patience, and intelligence into weapons more effective than tanks or artillery. Finland had not sought glory. It had only sought survival, and in achieving it, it had left a mark on history that the world would take decades to fully understand. When the Winter War ended in March 1940, most of the world framed the conflict in simple terms. A tiny nation resisting a giant, a heroic David defy a Goliath. Headlines spoke of Finnish courage, miraculous victories, and the bravery of a small army that had stood against one of the most powerful militaries in Europe. But these narratives, while compelling, missed the deeper truth. Finland had survived not through luck or inspiration alone, but through meticulous planning, environmental mastery, psychological insight, and an unwavering understanding of human and material limits. Historians, officers, and soldiers who examined the campaign after the fact the Red Army had far greater numbers, modern tanks, artillery, and aircraft. It had men trained for conventional warfare, ideology to motivate them, and resources to sustain prolonged operations. Yet these advantages were rendered meaningless by Finland's approach. The Finns had recognized the gaps in their own strength and exploited the weaknesses of the opponent. Knowledge, patience, and adaptability had become far more lethal than numbers, firepower, or doctrine. The world misunderstood this lesson. Many assumed that Finland's survival was miraculous, as if a nation of 5 million had defied fate through sheer will. Others claimed that Soviet failures were evidence of incompetence alone. In truth, it was a combination. The Soviets had underestimated both the terrain and the tactics of an enemy they dismissed, while the Finns had mastered both with methodical precision. Every forest, every frozen river, every silent snow-covered valley had become part of a strategy that transformed environmental familiarity into tactical supremacy. Finnish tactics influenced military thinking far beyond the Arctic forests. The Mati system, ambush techniques, use of small, highly mobile units, and mastery of terrain would be studied for decades. Officers from other nations visited Finland to understand how smaller forces could neutralize the advantage of overwhelming numbers. Modern special operations, guerrilla warfare, and winter combat doctrine owe much to the lessons learned in those frozen forests. The Winter War became a case study in asymmetric warfare long before the term existed. Yet for those who experienced it firsthand, the legacy was also personal and sobering. Soldiers carried the scars of frostbite, exposure, and relentless tension. Families remembered the loss of homes, villages, and community life disrupted by months of conflict. Survivors described a war that was brutal not because of spectacular battles, but because of endurance, patience, and the constant strain of living in extreme conditions while the enemy collapsed from their own errors. Victory had not been decisive. It had been survival, hard-won and fragile. The Red Army, forced to retreat and regroup, also carried lessons that would echo through history. Doctrine evolved. Winter training became rigorous, and awareness of the psychological effects of invisible enemies grew. But Soviet pride had been deeply wounded. Officers and soldiers alike learned to respect the power of terrain, the impact of mobility and intelligence, and the danger of underestimating a determined, adaptive opponent. Humiliation, not defeat alone, left the deepest mark. Today, the Winter War remains misunderstood by much of the public. The narrative of heroism dominates, while the precision, patience, and intelligence of Finnish strategy is often overlooked. It was not a spontaneous miracle. It was not luck. It was a calculated, disciplined application of knowledge against hubris. The snow did not turn red because of a single, glorious battle, but because small, invisible confrontations multiplied across weeks and months, breaking the confidence of the largest army in Europe. The lesson is timeless. Numbers alone do not guarantee victory. Technology alone does not secure success. Arrogance, miscalculation, and underestimation can undo empires. And mastery of the environment, patience, adaptability, and psychological insight can allow a smaller, weaker opponent to endure, survive, and in ways that history often underappreciates, triumph. Finland's story, hidden in snow and forest, remains one of the clearest examples of strategy and cunning prevailing where brute force could not. In the end, Finland survived because it understood what the Red Army did not. That, in war, the quiet, the invisible, and the patient can be deadlier than the loudest artillery, the largest army, or the most confident ideology. And while the world marveled at courage, it missed the subtle genius that had allowed a nation to endure against overwhelming odds. The snow had turned red, but not for spectacle. It had turned red as a testament to the lethal consequences of arrogance, the invisible power of knowledge, and the enduring will of a people who refused to be erased.